C.S. Lewis was a one-time atheist who was intellectually troubled by the existence of pain and evil in this world. But as he reflected on his objections to these things a bit more deeply, he began to find himself being drawn closer to the idea that God was real. In other words, his problem with pain, it didn't push him further away from God, it actually drew him closer to God. Indeed, he surmised that his problem with pain didn't actually make sense unless there was a God. He said, "My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be a part of this show, find myself in such violent reaction against it? A man feels wet when he falls into water because a man is not a water animal. A fish would not feel wet. Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying that it was nothing but a private idea of my own. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too. For the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my fancies. Thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, in other words, that the whole of reality was senseless, I found I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sense. Consequently, atheism turns out to be too simple. If the whole universe has no meaning, we should never have found out that it has no meaning. Just as if there was no light in the universe and therefore no creatures with eyes, we should never know it was dark. Dark would be a word without meaning. Let's try and visualize this. When someone complains about a line being crooked, he reveals he has an intrinsic knowledge of lines that are straight. He is effectively saying, that line falls short of what it could be. I know because I've seen a straight line. It falls short of perfection. He only understands the concept of crooked because he has first understood the concept of straight. That's how he knows that the bottom line is falling short of what it could be. Similarly, when a man complains that an apple is rotten, he reveals he has an intrinsic knowledge of what good apples should look like. He's saying that apple falls short of what it could be. It's imperfect. He only understands the rotten apple because he has first understood the good apple. To talk in terms of a bad one is revealing internal knowledge of a good one. When we complain about cold, we reveal a knowledge of warmth. When we complain about the dark, we reveal an intrinsic knowledge of light. When we complain about injustice, we reveal an intrinsic knowledge of justice. And when we complain about evil, we reveal an intrinsic knowledge of good. And this is Lewis's point. What is this good that we are comparing things to when we call other things evil? What is this benchmark of perfection that we intrinsically have a knowledge of? Where does it come from? When we use the word evil in relation to a person or act, we're saying that it falls short of something, but falls short of what? Where does this idea of good come from? Now, for the Christian, of course, this is all very easy to explain. This is a moral universe because God created it as such. God is the benchmark of moral perfection by which we recognize and judge evil. If God didn't exist as that absolute benchmark of good, then evil would become a word without meaning. In other words, if God wasn't the good apple, we would have no concept that anything was rotten here. If God wasn't the straight line, we would have no concept that anything was crooked here. It's the existence of God as that absolute good, as that benchmark, that makes this a moral universe by which we recognize and judge that which falls short. We can summarize by saying that whenever someone complains about evil, cruelty, or injustice in this world, they are unconsciously admitting two things. Number one, that there's an absolute good, and number two, that the person, the item, the act to blame falls short of that absolute good. Which sounds very much like the Christian worldview given to us by the Bible. The Bible tells us that God is absolutely good, but that because of the fall, which we looked at the beginning of this series, many things now fall short of that absolute good. The atheistic worldview, however, begins to crumble here. It doesn't have an absolute good by which to make sense of evil, and therefore they really have no intellectual grounding by which to call anything evil at all. Furthermore, there's no intellectual reason why they should be uncomfortable with anything evil that happens here. As C.S. Lewis puts it, if we are part of this show, and if we evolved through this show, and if there's nothing else apart from this show, then we really shouldn't have this inner feeling that there's something wrong with this show. We shouldn't feel uncomfortable with anything within the show. We shouldn't feel like there's something better than the show from which we have fallen. This is especially true since the evolutionary worldview literally relies on things that we would call evil in order to function. The evolutionary worldview relies on the survival of the fittest, namely stronger things overpowering, dominating and killing the weak. Richard Dawkins talked about the selfish gene that was necessary for the evolutionary worldview to function. Individual organisms exploiting, subjugating and killing others so that they might die, and in the competition for life, they themselves might then prosper and propagate their genes. If someone is a Darwinist, they really should have no problem with
bone cancer in children.
A purely Darwinist worldview would say that this is just natural selection in action and that weaker things should die out. I mean, what's your problem, Stephen? There's really no framework within the Darwinist ideology to have a problem with this. That should all feel perfectly natural to us if this is all there was and if we evolved through undirected processes. This is why even Richard Dawkins says,
I liked one phrase you used there. You talked about the sort of society in which we wish to live. And I'll tell you quite freely that a society based upon Darwinian principles is exactly the sort of society I do not wish to live in. It would be a terrible society, it would be. I do not wish to live in a Darwinian world. The world of nature is a Darwinian world. It's a very unpleasant world. It's a thoroughly unpleasant world, not the kind of world we wish to live in.
Stephen Fry and Richard Dawkins recoil from things that should feel perfectly natural to them under a Darwinian framework. Disease, subjugation, domination, killing, etc. And the question is, why do they feel uncomfortable? A fish doesn't feel wet in water because it belongs in the water. And human beings wouldn't feel out of place in a world of domination, killing and subjugation if we belonged in such a world. The fact that we do feel out of place in such a world tells us so much. In a strange way, anyone who complains about pain and evil in this world is at that very moment subconsciously affirming biblical tenets, that they're a fish out of water here, so to speak. They're affirming that there's an absolute good and that something about this life is falling short of that absolute good. Indeed, unless God exists, people like Stephen Fry really have no intellectual basis to feel uncomfortable with pain and evil at all. Indeed, to affirm their discomfort with pain and evil is in that very moment to affirm the existence of God, or at least to affirm the existence of an absolute good. Consider this, atheists, that your problem with pain is not evidence against the existence of God, but is actually evidence for the existence of God. If you merely evolved as part of this show, then you should really have no problem with any of these trials and injustices and diseases and evils that you see around you. It's just survival of the fittest under the evolutionary worldview. The fact that you do have a problem with them, and rightly so, I should add, should tell you that there's an absolute good in this universe and that you were made for something much, much more. Indeed, you were made to know that absolute good personally through his son, Jesus Christ. That's what C.S. Lewis did. He became a Christian in the end. You owe it to yourself to do the same thing.